You know this face. Not the way you know a neighbor's face or a colleague's face. You know it the way you know the face of a parent. Before memory, before language, before you understood what you were looking at. Long flowing hair the color of dark chestnut. A neat beard, pale skin. Eyes that are either blue or gray, depending on the painting. An expression of perfect serenity. You can summon it right now, without trying. You have seen it on the wall of a church, on the cover of a Bible, on a painting your grandmother had in her hallway, in a stained glass window with afternoon light cutting through it, in films, in illustrations, in every children's Bible ever printed. That face has been watching over you your entire life. And here is the thing that stopped me cold 3 months ago, sitting at my desk at 11 at night. Not a single person alive in the 1st century ever painted Jesus. Not one. The Gospels contain 64,000 words. Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, Luke. 64,000 words. And not one sentence describes what Jesus looked like. Not his height, not his skin color, not his hair, not the color of his eyes, not whether he was heavy-set or thin. Nothing. The most recognizable face in human history. And the people who actually knew him, the people who wrote the only surviving accounts of his life, never once told you what he looked like. My name is Nathan, 12 years teaching history at a Catholic school in Evansville, Indiana. Resigned in my early 40s when the sources stopped matching what I was being paid to teach. This channel is what I do with what I found. About 4 months ago, I was at the Indianapolis Museum of Art with my daughter, Maya. She's finishing a degree in art history. We were moving through the medieval and early Renaissance section when she stopped in front of a large Christ Pantocrator mosaic reproduction, Byzantine, probably 6th century. She stood there for a moment. Then she said something that I've been thinking about ever since. They all look the same, every single one. I knew what she meant. I'd been in enough art history contexts to know what she was pointing at. The same face, repeated across 6 centuries of Christian art. Same hair, same beard, same bone structure. Then she said, "Did he really look like that? Does anyone actually know?" And I didn't have an answer, which is a problem, because I spent 12 years teaching world history at a Catholic school. If anyone should have had an answer, it was me. That night at my kitchen table, I started looking for one. Let me start with the most remarkable absence in ancient biographical literature. Bart Ehrman, New Testament scholar at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, author of more than 30 books on early Christianity, put it as plainly as it can be put. The New Testament says almost nothing about what Jesus looked like. Almost nothing. Not that the description is sparse, not that the portrait is incomplete, almost nothing. The 4 canonical Gospels are our primary literary sources on Jesus. Combined, approximately 64,000 words. Biographical literature from the ancient world, when it describes a subject, typically gives you something. Suetonius describes Julius Caesar's skin tone, his baldness, his height. Plutarch describes Alexander's complexion, the way he tilted his head. Tacitus describes physical characteristics of the emperors he chronicled. Ancient biography, when it cares to, records appearance. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John record none. Not one gospel author bothered to tell you what the central figure of the story looked like. Ehrman notes that this is not because the gospel authors were uninterested in physical reality. Mark describes crowds pressing against Jesus, their hands grabbing his robe. John describes the weight of the stone rolled in front of a tomb. Luke describes the sound of a large crowd. They noticed physical things. They just never described his face. The only detail that comes close is in Matthew chapter 14, verse 36, where the hem of Jesus' garment is mentioned. The tzitzit, the ritual fringes worn by observant Jewish men of the period. Garment fringes. That is the entire physical description of Jesus of Nazareth in the 4 Gospels. There is a passage in the Hebrew Bible that the earliest followers of Jesus applied directly to him. Isaiah chapter 53, verse 2. He had no form or majesty that we should look at him, and no beauty that we should desire him. The Hebrew word here is tohar. It means outward form, physical appearance, stature. The verse is saying plainly, There was nothing about his appearance that would make you single him out. Nothing remarkable, nothing striking. The first Christians, the ones who knew the Hebrew scriptures, who were waiting for a Messiah whose arrival would fulfill the prophecies, expected this. They expected an ordinary-looking man, because that is what the prophecy said. But here is what stopped me when I really sat with this. It is not just that the Gospels have no physical description. The Church Fathers, the men who led early Christianity in the first 200 years, had the same understanding. And they wrote it down. Origen of Alexandria, writing around 248 of the Common Era, engaged with a pagan philosopher named Celsus, who had described Jesus as physically short and ugly. Origen's response is not, "That's wrong, and here's what Jesus actually looked like." His response is theological. He argues that beauty of soul transcends beauty of body. He does not dispute the physical description. Tertullian of Carthage, writing around 200 CE, is explicit. He quotes Isaiah 53 and describes Jesus' body as without comeliness. Justin Martyr, writing around 150 CE, called Jesus without beauty, dishonored, and inglorious. Clement of Alexandria, around 190 CE, described him as not remarkable but ignoble. These men led the early church. They wrote within 100 to 200 years of Jesus' death. They had access to traditions, oral histories, and documents we no longer have. And all of them said the same thing. He was ordinary. He was not a man you would have looked at twice. There is a moment I want you to sit with. Every person in that list, Origen, Tertullian, Justin Martyr, Clement of Alexandria, was writing within 2 centuries of Jesus' actual life. And then look at what happened over the next few centuries. Look at how the image you know came into existence, because it did not emerge from witnesses. It emerged from art. And the art did not come from historical research. It came from pagan models. Before Constantine, before the year 313 of the Common Era, when Christianity became a legal religion in the Roman Empire, Christian art did not depict Jesus the way you know him. The oldest surviving Christian images are in the Roman catacombs, 2nd and 3rd century. The Jesus in those images is unrecognizable to modern eyes. Young, clean-shaven, short hair, beardless. Not the figure from Renaissance painting, not the Christ Pantocrator. A young shepherd, modeled on the Greek deity Hermes Kriophoros. Hermes carrying a sheep on his shoulders, sometimes modeled on the Greek god Orpheus. The early church, operating in a Greco-Roman visual culture, depicted Jesus using the visual vocabulary available to it. The familiar image, the long hair, the beard, the composed and regal bearing, emerged after Constantine. Specifically, it emerged from a merger. Scholars Robin M. Jensen of the University of Notre Dame, in her 2005 book Face to Face, Portraits of the Divine in Early Christianity, and Richard Villadesau of Fordham University have both documented this transformation carefully. The new image absorbed features from 2 pagan sources. Zeus, king of the Greek gods, depicted consistently with long flowing hair, a full beard, and an expression of sovereign calm. And Serapis, a syncretic Greco-Egyptian deity who combined elements of Zeus and Osiris, also typically depicted with long curling hair and a beard. In the late 3rd and early 4th century, as Christianity moved from a persecuted minority to a state religion, the visual identity of Jesus shifted from the young shepherd to the divine king, from the Hellenistic youth to the seated sovereign. The face you know is the face of Zeus. Renamed. Now let me tell you about the document that gave Renaissance painters their blueprint, because this is the part that, when I found it, I had to put down my coffee and read a second time. Every major painting of Jesus from the 14th century onward, Leonardo, Michelangelo, Raphael, El Greco, was painted by artists working from a specific visual tradition. That tradition was anchored in part by a document that purported to be a letter from a Roman official named Publius Lentulus. The letter was addressed to the Roman Senate. It claimed to describe Jesus based on first-hand observation. The description was vivid. Hair the color of ripe hazelnut, parted in the middle, falling in waves. A full beard, slightly forked, grey-blue eyes, noble bearing. An expression of such dignity and serenity that beholders are simultaneously awed and comforted. Renaissance painters read this document as historical evidence. They took it as the eyewitness description the Gospels had never provided. The problem: no Roman governor named Publius Lentulus ever governed Judea, not in any Roman record, not in Josephus, who documented Roman provincial administration extensively, not in Tacitus, not in Suetonius, not in any Roman administrative document from the period. The office the letter describes, governor of Judea before the tenure of Pontius Pilate, did not exist in the form described, and the letter does not appear in any manuscript until the 13th century of the Common Era, more than 1200 years after Jesus died. The humanist scholar Lorenzo Valla, one of the great textual critics of the 15th century, the same man who proved the donation of Constantine was a forgery, examined the Lentulus letter in the 1440s. His verdict: forgery. The German scholar Ernst von Dobschütz, in an 1899 study, traced 75 surviving manuscript copies of the letter. All of them dated to the 13th through 15th centuries, all from France, Germany, and Italy. Not one from the ancient world, not one predating 1200 years of silence. The document that defined the face of Jesus for every major European painter was a medieval invention, exposed as a fraud 6 centuries ago, still reproduced on crucifixes and church walls and devotional cards around the world today. I want to tell you something about the picture on my kitchen wall when I was growing up. It was a print of Warner Salmon's Head of Christ. You may not know the name, but you know the image. Soft-focused, soft brown hair, slightly long, blue eyes, an expression of gentle, luminous peace. It is the most reproduced image in the history of American Christianity. Scholars estimate approximately 500 million copies printed. It hangs in hospitals and homes and churches across the United States. The Salvation Army used it in World War II. The American Bible Society distributed it. For a lot of American Christians, this is not a painting they encountered once. It is the face they saw every morning of their childhood. Warner Salmon was a commercial illustrator from Chicago. He painted the Head of Christ in 1940. For a Christian devotional calendar. He was not a historian. He had not conducted archaeological or textual research into the appearance of first-century Galilean Jewish men. He painted what American Christians in 1940 wanted Jesus to look like. Blue-eyed, Northern European features, gentle, safe. He built on a visual tradition that ran back through the Renaissance to the Byzantine mosaics to the Zeus model of the 4th century. Layer upon layer upon layer, each generation inheriting the previous generation's interpretation. None of it connected to a single historical fact about a man who lived in 1st century Galilee. I stood in front of that print for most of my childhood, felt it watching over me. And the man in the image had no more historical basis than a painting of Zeus. Think about every cross you have ever walked past, every painting, every film, every stained glass window with the same long-haired, pale-skinned figure looking down at you. You were never told the image was invented. You were shown it the way you were shown a photograph, as if someone had been there, as if the tradition had handed down something real. What was handed down was a copy of a forgery built on a pagan model. And what nobody told you is that the men who led the early church, the ones who were actually close to the source, described someone completely different. Someone ordinary. Someone you wouldn't have looked at twice on a street in Jerusalem. In the year 2001, the BBC commissioned a forensic reconstruction. Not an artistic interpretation, not a theological statement. A forensic reconstruction. Richard Neve, a forensic artist at the University of Manchester, who had spent his career producing facial reconstructions for criminal investigations, was given 3 skulls. Not Jesus's skull. No one has Jesus's skull. He was given 3 skulls from 1st century Galilean Jewish men, excavated by archaeologists working in the region. Using computerized tomography, the same imaging technology used in modern medicine, Neve and his team produced a reconstruction of what a typical 1st century Galilean Jewish man would have looked like. The result was published the following year as the cover story of Popular Mechanics. December 2002. The title, The Real Face of Jesus. The face on the cover of Popular Mechanics looked nothing like Warner Salmon's print. Broad face, dark olive skin, short, dark, tightly curled hair, dark brown eyes, a full, rounded beard, height approximately 5 feet 1 inch, weight approximately 110 pounds. The magazine received its highest ever volume of reader complaints after that issue. People were not upset because they thought the science was wrong. People were upset because the image contradicted something they felt they owned. The face they had grown up with. The face that had been watching over them their entire lives. The science had not told them that Jesus looked foreign. The science had told them that their Jesus had always been foreign, that the comfortable face was an invention. And the reaction to that scientific finding, 4 centuries after Lorenzo Valla exposed the Lentulus letter as a fraud, was exactly the same. People wanted to keep the face. Let me give you the academic consensus because it matters to be precise about this. Joni Taylor of King's College London published a full study in 2018, What Did Jesus Look Like?, published by Bloomsbury T&T Clark. Taylor used a different method from Neve. She gathered surviving paintings from the Fayum region in Egypt, portraits painted onto mummies in the 1st through 3rd centuries of the Common Era. These are the only surviving painted portraits of real people from the ancient Near East during the period of Jesus' life. They show what actual people in that region actually looked like: dark brown to black hair, worn short, olive brown skin, brown eyes, medium to short height. Taylor's conclusion on height, approximately 5 feet 5 inches, slightly taller than Neve's estimate, still well under 5 feet 8. On hair, almost certainly short. This is where Paul becomes useful as an inadvertent source, 1 Corinthians chapter 11 verse 14. Paul writes, "Does not the very nature of things teach you that if a man has long hair, it is a disgrace to him?" Paul was writing to a Jewish Christian community. He was applying a cultural norm that both he and his audience shared. Long hair on a man was considered dishonorable in 1st century Jewish culture. If Jesus had worn the flowing hair of the standard devotional image, it would have been a mark of shame in his own cultural context. He almost certainly did not. The evidence converges on the same picture from multiple independent directions: short, dark, curly hair, olive to dark brown skin, brown eyes, medium build, medium height, unremarkable by the standards of his own time and place, which is exactly what the Church Fathers said, which is exactly what Isaiah 53 said, which is exactly what the absence of any physical description in the Gospels implies. The ordinary man from Galilee. Now I want to give you Benítez, because Benítez, after 40 years in the primary sources, came to a description of Jesus that agrees with the science in some respects and departs from it in one specific way. In Caballo de Troya, Benítez's time traveler narrator Jason describes Jesus in direct first-hand detail. 1.81 meters tall. The narrator calls him El Gigante, the giant. Athletic build, described as having 0 body fat. Amber-colored eyes, described as color miel liquida, liquid honey. Olive-toned skin, clearly Middle Eastern. Strong Semitic features. The olive skin and the Middle Eastern features, consistent with the forensic science. The height, not consistent. 1.81 meters is nearly 6 feet. A man of that height in 1st century Galilee would have been extraordinary. The average 1st century Jewish man, based on skeletal evidence, was between 1.55 and 1.66 meters. Neve's reconstruction, 5 feet 1. Taylor's estimate, 5 feet 5. Benítez, 5 feet 11. Benítez spent 40 years in those sources. His motivation was not sensationalism, but the gap between his reconstruction and the forensic consensus is significant, and he acknowledged something important in how he framed the Caballo de Troya project. He was not claiming to work from a photograph. He was reconstructing, from every available source, a person no surviving image ever captured. He agreed with the science on the things the science is clear about: skin, coloring, Middle Eastern heritage. He diverged on height, which the science cannot determine from skull shape alone, and which Benítez drew from sources whose reliability is itself a matter of investigation. The irony is exact. Benítez, the investigator who spent more time on this question than almost anyone in the 20th century, agrees with the forensic scientists on everything that contradicts the popular image most sharply. Not the pale-skinned European, not the blue-eyed serenity portrait, a Middle Eastern Jewish man from an occupied territory in the 1st century of the Common Era. Both Benítez and the forensic scientists looking nothing like the face that has been sold to the world for 1,000 years. You are going to see that face today. You have already seen it this morning, probably, without registering it, on a calendar, in a window, in a fragment of memory from a church you visited on a holiday years ago. That face, long hair, full beard, the blue or gray eyes, the calm that is just slightly too composed to belong to a living person. And now you know what it is. It is the face of Zeus, built in the 4th century by artists who were shifting Christianity from a persecuted minority to an imperial religion and needed an image that would project power and divinity to a Greco-Roman audience. Supplemented in the Renaissance by artists working from a letter that is a 13th century forgery. Standardized in American homes by a commercial illustrator from Chicago who painted what his audience wanted to see. Exposed as historically baseless at every stage, still reproducing itself, here is something I want to be honest about. The institutional church did not construct this image through malice. The men who commissioned those 6th century mosaics in Ravenna did not have forensic science. They did not have the Fayum portraits, they did not have King's College London. They had the image they inherited, and they passed it forward. Each generation handed the next generation an image, and the next generation assumed it had been handed down from witnesses. None of them had. But here is what is harder to excuse. Lorenzo Valla exposed the Lentulus letter in the 1440s. The forgery was named, the scholarship was published, and the church did not change the image. The paintings continued, the crucifixes continued, the Warner Salmon prints continued. The institution decided the face is more useful than the truth about the face. That decision has been made and remade quietly for 6 centuries. Let me give you the complete record. The Gospels, 64,000 words, 0 physical description. The only clothing detail, ritual fringes on his garment. The church fathers within 200 years of his death, consistent. Not beautiful, not striking, ordinary. Isaiah 53. No form or majesty that we should look at him, no beauty that we should desire him. The visual tradition, Zeus and Serapis in the 4th century. Byzantine standardization by the 6th, medieval forgery in the 13th. Renaissance painters copying the forgery in the 15th and 16th. Warner Salmon from Chicago in 1940. The Forensic Science Neve 2001. Taylor 2018. Short dark curly hair, dark olive skin, dark eyes, medium height. Paul's inadvertent testimony. Long hair on a man was a disgrace in 1st century Jewish culture. Jesus almost certainly had short hair. Benítez, Middle Eastern, olive skin, amber eyes. Agrees with science on complexion, disagrees on height. 500 million copies of a 1940 painting, no historical basis. Derived, step by step, from a pagan deity. Here is what stayed with me, after the museum and the books and the months at the desk. It is not the forgery. The Lentulus letter is interesting as historical evidence of how institutions operate, but it is not what actually moved me. What moved me was simpler. The fact that the people who actually knew Jesus, who sat across from him at meals, who heard him teach, who stood at the foot of the cross, never once wrote down what he looked like. Matthew was there. John was there. They wrote extensively about what he said and what he did, and neither of them told you what he looked like. Not because they forgot, not because it seemed irrelevant in the moment. I think it is because, to them, the appearance was beside the point. What mattered was the words, the healings, the way he moved through a crowd, the way he spoke to people no one else was speaking to. The face was incidental. The people who knew him best were the least interested in the face. And the people who never met him spent 1,000 years arguing about what the face looked like, painting it, reproducing it, selling it on devotional cards. There is something in that inversion that feels like the whole story. The eyewitnesses recorded the person, the institution recorded the image, and over 14 centuries the image displaced the person. The face became more familiar than the words, the painting more recognized than the gospel. You know this face, or you thought you did. What you know is a 4th century artistic composite of Greek mythology, refined through a forged letter, standardized by Byzantine mosaic artists, carried through Renaissance painting studios, and mass-produced for American consumers in the 20th century. The man it was supposed to represent looked like a 1st century Galilean Jewish peasant. Short dark hair, olive skin, brown eyes, unremarkable. The kind of man the earliest Christians expected, because they had a prophecy that said plainly, no beauty, no majesty, nothing that would make you single him out. The face you have carried your whole life is a beautiful, elaborate, 14 centuries in the making answer to a question no one who actually knew him thought to ask. Now you know the answer to the question they never asked, and you know who built the face and why. That's the question you get to carry.